Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining us on this, what I regard as immensely important question of locally led adaptation. We see the ravages of climate change affecting communities across the globe in developed and developing countries, but of course, developing countries are much more vulnerable both to the impacts and also are less prepared or able to facilitate adaptation and build resilience of communities. So the CFAR Alliance, alongside MicroSave and indeed many others around the world, have been looking at how we might enable and enhance locally led adaptation. And we are going to focus on two aspects of this today that are covered in the white paper that the CFAR Alliance and MSC have just released, asking what role can blended finance and digital technologies play in enhancing and enabling locally led adaptation. So our agenda is, first of all, to hear from Wendy Chamberlain, who is actually up in a climate vulnerable area of northern Kenya right now, and so kindly recorded a video for us. And then Eric from CARE will talk about what they're doing with their BSLAs and how that might fit into locally led adaptation. I will then give you a quick overview of the white paper, and then my colleague Arjan will outline plans for the next step and the learning agenda that we have, and hopefully we'll be able to have a good 20 minutes or so for discussion. So with that, and hoping that this somewhat lengthy preamble has allowed enough people to join, we will hear from Wendy.
Hi everyone, my name is Wendy Chamberlain. I'm a Vice President for Research and Advisory at Busara. We're a behavioral science firm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm really grateful to my colleagues at MSC for letting me share a few thoughts on why I think this topic of looking at the role that financial services can play in supporting the ambitions of locally led adaptation is so important. There's a few things that I think about when I think about what we're trying to achieve with financial inclusion and what we can learn from efforts around locally led adaptation. So often the solutions we pursue around financial inclusion are about treating a specific problem and hoping that the solutions can be scaled. I think what we learn from locally led efforts is that context matters. What works in one community for one purpose may not be the same solution that works in another community. We also learn that people's lives are financially complex, and so often we can forget this when we're pursuing scale right away as a path to solutions. Instead, it serves us well to remember the complexity of people's lived experiences and thinking about how we can better perhaps listen to local communities about what they need financial services to do for them, to be most supportive of their ambitions, most supportive of their ability to adapt and to become resilient to climate shocks and stresses. I think what we may also potentially miss, and we have the opportunity to learn from locally led efforts, is that while solutions may be unique to context, our approach to listening and our approach to designing solutions may be what can scale. So how we approach listening to customers about what their priorities are, how we approach bringing in the private sector, bringing in the public sector to participate in these conversations may be a part of that effort as well. I hope the rest of this conversation goes well, and that we look forward just to hearing more about what you're doing to engage with local communities as part of your efforts to see how financial services can support their efforts to pursue climate adaptation and resilience. Thanks so much. Bye.
So thank you so much to Wendy for her thoughts. She was at COP28 and came back enthused about the role of community participation in locally led adaptation. And that sets Eric up very nicely to talk about the outstanding work that CARE have been doing on this issue in the context of their VSLAs. Eric, over to you, and just say next slide when you need me to advance.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Graham. And it's a pleasure to be here presenting. Just to echo a lot of what Wendy said is focuses on the work that we're doing at CARE with our VSLAs. We have just piloted a project called the Digital Care Package, and this next slide, sorry. This project is all about creating inclusive partnerships with local organizations to develop digital programming that works with our VSLA groups. It focuses on access to affordable devices, digital literacy, relevant tools, and addressing the gender norms around technology. So one of the key things we found is that we need to have the feedback from the local community. So like we run our Women Respond initiative, which is targeting gathering information directly from our participants, who are the women in our VSLA groups, to understand their needs so that we can now customize our solutions to fit the day-to-day needs of these VSLA groups. So it's very locally led, based in the fact that we're getting feedback from the women we work with. We're making sure that this is all relevant to what they're doing, and then we're going out to try and source and customize solutions with local partners to meet these needs. Next slide. Yeah, so some of the challenges that the women highlighted were the cost and logistics around access to devices. This has been a big issue, and it goes across the board for any programs that are trying to encourage digital inclusion. Looking at training, the soft skills needed to train both trainers from local communities and the participants of the programs to ensure that they actually understand how to use these tools and devices that we're bringing into their communities. Looking at tech users, creating digital solutions that cater to those basic mobile phones, basic mobile needs of these communities. So like trying to find partners who understand that the last mile that we're trying to reach don't always have access to the smartphones and such. And then obviously navigating the gender dynamics around technology. It's very culturally sensitive in some areas where the local representation of how women interact with technology is misunderstood. And so it's the balance of making sure that we are careful while introducing tools and considerate to all parties involved in the programming. And then coordinating with reliable partners. That's a key aspect of this. Next slide. So our solution is on making sure that everything is relevant. And this is done through, as I said, speaking to women, understanding their needs, and finding the partners that can customize these solutions to them. One thing we highlighted was that among our VSLA groups, we have different personas. So we have to make sure that we make sure that everything that we're doing is addressing the needs of these different personas. So we have the rural women who need tools that are easily accessible, affordable, and can be used without too much training that is necessary in terms of like adapting to smartphone technology and such. So we have enterprising women who have solutions. We have to customize solutions to enhance their business capabilities and in what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. The ambitious hustlers who are now looking at scaling their businesses and moving into enterprise. How can we customize tools that are going to help them get digitally inclusive to the financial systems and allow them to like scale accordingly? And then the resilient refugees who face issues with cash transfers, issues around security. So the tools have to be customized to make sure that they all fit the needs of these groups. Next slide. So our key concept here is locally led partnerships, finding people who are going to be focused on addressing the same issues, partnering with organizations that are looking at creating, overcoming the device accessibility barriers that women face, innovative financing models that allow the women to like have asset financing for devices, digital financial tools for VSLA groups. So looking at tools that are relevant to the group's day-to-day needs. So how can we use these to introduce them to record keeping? How can we enhance their operational efficiency and cut down on the drastic expenditure that they have on the paper ledgers, which also is a climate issue. And then the private partnership, the public-private synergies with digital inclusion. Collaborate with local governments to ensure that we are lobbying to change the views around pricing for aspects like mobile money, data costs, and harnessing the private sector's capability for good, for the public good, and to show how they are included in boosting the work that we're doing to include these communities into the digital ecosystems. And then obviously layering all this into our programs across the board. So making sure that this is something that we implement in different programs, that being agriculture, health sector, climate change, whatever we're working in, how can we build this type of strategic partnership across the board? Next slide. And then the second aspect is the digital financial transaction. So we work with local mobile networks who have mobile money. We're looking at the local banks who are using agency banking to create a more accessible path for the VSLA group members, so that they can now start using these systems and meeting them where they are. Because in a lot of cases, it's hard for groups to go out and open bank accounts because it requires a lot of documentation, sometimes collateral to get loans. So how can we work with our local partners to start viewing these communities as actual customers and not just a CSR initiative that has been the case for the past few years? So like in an example of this would be like we have a digital sub-wallets program that has shown amazing results on how people can save to specific needs. And we're trying to work with partners like MTN and Airtel to build this into their mobile money wallet operating system, so the USSD menus. So people can now be saving money on these digital platforms towards specific needs. And then by partnering with these local organizations, it's also teaching them how to influence the way that our participants use their tools. Being able to clearly articulate what's available on these platforms for the groups to use. So on the mobile money menus, understanding how to use the agency banking networks, understanding how to set up mobile money accounts, and working directly with them to participate in the long term. So next slide. Oh, okay, we're at the end. I was being time sensitive. And yeah, so in conclusion, our commitment is to, rely on local community involvement and the digital inclusivity for us to achieve sustainable financial empowerment. We're committed to collaborating with our local partners. We're committed to delivering tailored solutions that respect the unique needs of these communities, breaking down the barriers and building a foundation for sustainable growth. Yeah, that's what we're doing with the digital care package. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate it, and also for your time sensitivity. That's really good. Now you've put the challenge out to me to do the same. So, as I said, the CFAR Alliance and MSC have been working on a locally led adaptation white paper, and I want to just quickly start by just reiterating why we think this is so important. This is from work that we did in Bihar in northern India, talking to farmers about how flooding has affected their livelihoods. And you can see that the trend is upwards, but the flooding has also been significantly enhanced by additional climate-driven challenges of drought and heat wave. And this has also had secondary effects that have affected, for example, pest infestation. And when we went to Nigeria with the CODIS to look at what the impacts of these were, we analyzed it using the DFID 5 capitals approach and looked at what was happening. And what we see is a relentless erosion of the 5 capitals, with the exception of this brief upward tick where the government helped with water access in the area of Nigeria that we were looking at in Bugu. Everything else, from natural resources to financial resources to social networks and relationships and the human skills, all of them have seen this this relentless erosion, which the people themselves attribute to the changing climate. So this is a really critical issue that is beginning to impact vulnerable communities very, very significantly. So then I go running to some of the climate modeling portals to look at what they say, and of course the answer to that is it's very scary, and we see very significant impacts likely to occur in a wide variety of areas. I've given just one example here of Tanzania, and you can see that soil water stress is going to have very, very significant impact. And also, similarly, you can see from the World Bank that a lot of the heat stress that will occur. And what I want you to see here is that both of these are on the basis of RCP 4.5, which essentially is the current trajectory that we're on, because we're not doing enough to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And this is going to be, this is the scenario that they're projecting for 2050. But the issue with these climate models is that they just are not, they go down to sort of district level at best, and they're not precise enough for helping local communities adapt to climate change. So we really need a completely different approach, obviously informed by these climate models, but we need to look at what the hyper-local realities are, because how climate change affects someone at the top of the hill is very different quite often to how it will affect people at the bottom of that hill. So, we're going to need to help them with adaptation to protect their livelihoods and the shared infrastructure that supports those, and also overcome the social obstacles. So locally led adaptation is about local government working with community-based organizations in order to diagnose, plan, implement, and monitor adaptation strategies. And that combination of local government and the local community is where the magic happens, so to speak. Now, this is really about inverting the story of decentralization. And what I mean by that is increasingly there have been efforts to decentralize government and respond much better at a subnational level to the requirements and needs of more localized communities. So locally led adaptation takes starts, instead of pushing down from the central government, works with locally led climate change plans that, as I say, are built from a collaboration between local government and community-based organizations like CARE and many others. And then feeds that information back up aggregates it, and then hopefully is able to access money from the Green Climate Fund and other multilateral funds that are designed to support locally led adaptation. And done well, this should improve accountability and buy-in at the local level. It should increase flexibility, obviously increase participation, and indeed the responsiveness of adaptation plans to real local needs. So one approach that we postulate that might be helpful is to break it down into a series of subparts. So the first piece is to really understand the facts, the factors that impact the locally led adaptation strategy you're going to build. So that's obviously the regulatory and policy environment, government's planned adaptation measures. So obviously the National Adaptation Plan or climate adaptation plans. Also to look at climate data and forecasts, even though, as I said, they tend to be too high level, they do provide overviews of what is going to be most, sensitive and difficult to deal with. And then obviously the financial services landscape, if we're going to help these communities with financial services to respond to the locally led adaptation plans. So then there's this big participatory planning process where we go through essentially 5 steps: situation analysis, looking at desired future, then analyzing the barriers, looking at pathways to get to that future, and then finally looking at how we might finance that future. And those 5 components taken together should give us the locally led adaptation strategy with the purpose and the timing and how long it is and who acts and who benefits and who is affected, as well as the financing strategy. And I hope moving forward, the role for digital technology. But obviously a plan alone, a strategy alone isn't enough. And we need to move to implementation. And that's where I think, what I call governance and institutional arrangements, so risk analysis, participatory monitoring frameworks, and so on, come into play. And in amongst all of this are really important feedback loops, both between that governance system and also because with these plans, they need to feed back up into the national climate change plans as well, so that they influence how the national level is thinking about it. Because again, local impacts of climate change vary significantly, and if we have just top-down planned adaptation, then I think there's a very real risk that you get what's called maladaptation, where some communities are negatively affected by efforts to adapt. So what role should blended finance play in all of this? Well, if you look at the UNEP estimates for adaptation costs, right now we are getting a 5th to a 7th of what will be required for adaptation. So clearly we're going to need to move from a grant-based system to a more credit-based system, or a system that crowds in private capital to help. And that will essentially be done in 3 ways. 1, leverage; secondly, reducing the average cost of capital; and then thirdly, reducing risk. So when you look at that, there are a series of instruments that are well known to the sort of catalytic finance people, for each of these categories, and in some cases, in overlapping categories. And I think that we need to spend quite a bit of time looking at this and working with the big multilateral funds to think through how we can use blended finance to seriously leverage the funds that are being given by the richer countries. And we know that those funds are A, too little, and B, in many cases are being promised but not delivered, we are going to have to find ways of amplifying their impact. And I think that blended finance could play a very, very important role. The other area which I think has been underexplored and we need to do a lot of work on, and I think this is where the Seafire Alliance can play a particularly important role, is to look at the role that digital technology can play to optimize and scale locally led adaptation. We have a growing array of digital services and technologies that could play a key role in facilitating not just the planning process, but also implementation and indeed the governance and monitoring of these plans. So obviously, when we're planning, we could crowdsource data, we could have IVR and voice-based surveys, we could deploy community-based sensors and leverage citizen science. Clearly, the satellite and drone data would be very valuable. There are some great startups and techs that are providing local weather alerts that will be important. As Eric mentioned, mobile money services can play a really, really important role, as can digital record keeping, not just for financial services, but more broadly. And then finally, of course, there is a growing move towards trying to figure out how carbon credits can be deployed, and hopefully at much lower cost, because right now around about 40% of carbon credits go to the audit and accreditation process. And we need to get to a situation where that is, much, much lower percentage, so that the real value goes to the people creating, the farmers and the people who deserve the carbon credits. Now, all of this is good, but as Eric pointed out, many of these vulnerable communities don't have access to smartphones or are uncomfortable using them and so on. And I think that this is where a role of a variety of outreach agents could play a very important role. Now, that might be international NGOs like CARE that are doing community-based outreach. It might be microfinance organization staff. It could be agricultural extension officers, or it could even be cash out agents of mobile money or bank operators. But the issue will be that these people need to be well-trained and conversant and comfortable with digital technologies so that we get the best out of them in the context of locally led adaptation. And that's something we need to work on and learn about a great deal more. Now, as a final slide, I just want to suggest that there are really important synergies between locally led adaptation and financial services, because if we're able to pull down both international and national climate funds, as well as the international impact funds through blended finance instruments to deliver to the various types of organizations that are delivering financial services to these vulnerable communities, then their question is going to be, how do I manage risk? And if we have a digitized approach to locally led adaptation, then we're going to be able to provide a lot of the data that those financial institutions need in order to respond to the needs for financial services in those vulnerable communities. Because the one thing that they lack at the moment is that ability to have the data to manage the risk. And therefore, as Eric, I'm sure, will attest, these communities are underserved, if not completely unserved, by these financial institutions. And I think that digitally enabled, locally led adaptation gives us the potential to redress that balance, particularly if some of the risk of lending into these more risky environments and communities is mitigated with blended finance. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Arjan and have him talk through next steps. And then once he's done that, we will open up for questions and comments. Arjan, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Graham. So I'll just give you a flavor of some of the things that we've planned told that for the next couple of months. We will begin by trying to recruit new members to join this particular sort of convening and group. And there are a couple of key stakeholders that we're interested in. So some of the organizations that we are intending to target so that they can come and start, sharing their learnings and their expertise in advancing locally led adaptation approaches include NGOs and NINGOs like CARE, for example, and national NGOs. We're trying to see whether we can attract organizations like UNCDF. In particular, they have a very long-running project called the Locale Project that provides performance-based grants to local governments, municipalities across many of the LDCs. We're trying to see if we can recruit some microfinance institutions, for example, that work directly with the kinds of communities and individuals that we're interested in. We're also interested in broader development finance institutions. So this is both from northern sort of donor-led DFIs, but also increasingly important are national level development finance institutions. For example, in India, organizations like NABARD are very, very important. And then finally, we're quite keen to ensure that we bring in some of the digital technology providers and bring in some industry leaders and think tanks as part of this group. The second phase of this is to really test and build on the work that has happened around participatory, locally led planning, based on some of the findings from the working paper that Graham just presented, but also building on the expertise and knowledge of a myriad of organizations across different geographies that have been working on, working with different communities to do locally led planning. It's quite clear that there needs to be a serious step change in how we plan and our capacity to be able to meet the needs in the next couple of years around climate. So we're quite keen to sort of ramp up this work on participatory, locally led planning processes. The third element of our learning agenda will focus on expanding our knowledge and our case studies of how we can best use blended finance instruments to enable locally led adaptation finance, all for sort of leveraging, using public finance to leverage additional private finance for adaptation at the local level, for reducing risk, as well as for decreasing the cost of capital and decreasing interest rates for these kinds of activities. And then finally, and ideally, we would like to recruit different organizations across all of the three areas that we want to focus on. But I think the last one in particular, we're quite keen to do this jointly with other CPR members, is to start building out an inventory of digital tools and methods that could aid in advancing locally led adaptation. Along the lines of the slide that Graham just showed on different locally led technologies or digital technologies that could aid locally led adaptation. So that was it in terms of sort of what we're planning to do in the next couple of months, and we're very keen to develop partnerships and ensure that we're not the only ones that are interested in these activities, and that we bring on board your organizations and the work that you're doing to ensure that we're able to drive some of these agendas that we think are quite critical.
Great. Thanks so much, Arjun.
Thank
so
you.
let me now open it up for conversation, questions, comments, and wisdom from the collective that is on the call. Not all at once, one at a time.
I guess I'll go ahead. This is Liz McGinnis, and I'd like to know what role you see for industry leaders and think tanks joining in your collab.
That's a great question, Liz, and thank you for it. So really, I mean, industry leaders and think tank is, of course, as you've guessed, a catch-all, but I think that the way we're looking at this is that there have been some great starts on locally led adaptation, but we really need to accelerate this because across the globe, vulnerable communities are being impacted by climate change. And if we're going to make meaningful change for them, just top-down national adaptation plans will not cut it. And so, but of course, almost by definition, locally led adaptation is a piecemeal exercise. You need to go into local communities and really work with them to understand their needs and go through that big planning process that we outlined. So bringing in industry leaders and think tanks, I think, is designed to guide us in terms of what has already been done, because obviously we're by no means first to the party, and there's lots to learn from other people. But secondly, also eventually to influence back up the chain, so to speak, to really begin to map out ways that we can scale locally led adaptation well beyond what's currently going on. Arjun, did you want to add anything to that, or does that cover it broadly?
I think that's good, Bram, from my side.
Okay, super.
Looks like you have a question from Mary.
Yeah, just double check before we go to Mary. Liz, does that answer your question or not really? Please say
yes, that answers it. Thank you. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks so much. Mary.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. My name again is Mary, and I'm coming into this call from Kampala in Uganda. I'm a lecturer at Makerere University here in Kampala, and I'm quite interested in what you just presented right now, because we currently, as I speak, have been or are having a consortium with a number of organizations, which include the Ministry of Finance here in Uganda, the Uganda Institute of Bankers and Financing Institutions, together with the CBO. And what we are trying to do is to exactly test what you're what you are saying, which is a blended financing solution for locally led adaptation. So we have been trying to bring together different partners to work around what could be done, and that's what excites me. But in addition, currently we are doing some research around the effectiveness of locally led adaptation interventions in East Africa. So we are working together with an organization which is based in Nairobi, Kenya, under funding or with funding from FCDO. I'm not sure if our colleagues on this call are conversant with this organization, but it's the development arm of the British government. So we are doing this kind of effectiveness, understanding the effectiveness of adaptation interventions around all of the 9 countries in East Africa. And so at the end there, when the speaker mentioned about creating partnerships, I was wondering, like, how does somebody who wants to partner with you, as people like us who are in the same field trying, to test out how these different solutions work, how can we partner with you? That's one thing. Secondly, I see on the screen there that government is not one of the partners that you're looking at. And I wanted to know, one, why government is not there? But secondly, to also say, like in our case, we think that government, it's, because of its wide reach, it's easy. Like in Uganda, for example, we have a model which is called the parish development model, which is really a bottom-up community planning development, model, where both financing, resources, and decision-making try to be devolved to the local people. And we are trying to build on this model, which is already being funded and, scaled up by government, and to see how, as researchers, we can try to tweak around it and see if it's possible to work through that to then catalyze private sector financing. I'm sorry I cannot say everything here, but I think in a nutshell, what I'm saying is we see that there is a lot of value in having government on board. So I want to know why government is not included here, and also how organizations that would want to partner with you can do that, and in which way. Thank you so much.
So Mary, two really, first of all, congratulations on your work, and two really great questions. First, please reach out to me and my team, and we'll be delighted to collaborate and work alongside you. We have an office in Nairobi and actually work extensively in Uganda and many of the other countries in the region. So I really, partnership, I think, can be really, really easy. And yeah, please just reach out to me, and I'll put you in touch with the right people. In terms of government, that is a really good question. And I think that, so just make an observation and a tip of hat to Uganda, which I think is ahead of many, many governments on this, because they have got really quite active work on locally led adaptation. We actually trained some of the local government officials in Uganda and were really impressed with how engaged they were with these issues and how thoughtful they were. And of course, you've got UNCDS Local, their sort of nexus is in Uganda itself. So, I think Uganda is a really good example and a great place to be learning from. But back to why we didn't have government on this list. I don't think that there's any reason why we shouldn't. The question is whether government officials, have the time and energy to be involved in this type of, collaborative arrangement. If you can steer us to government officials who you feel would have the time and energy to be involved, then, obviously we'd be very interested in working with them as well. But I also like to defer to Eric a little bit on this because, you deal with local government in many countries, Eric. What has been your experience?
Oh, thanks, Graham. So in particular in Uganda, I do have to say it is a lot easier to work with the government because this is an initiative that they're pushing. We've seen that at the community level, before programs engage with participants, we have to go through the CBOs or the CBD, community development offices, to explain what we're doing. And usually that allows you the opportunity to either layer what your program is about onto something that's being initiated or implemented by the government. And that has been helpful. And they do take a very proactive approach to engaging with partnerships. So in Uganda, it's been very good. I would say the same for Rwanda because of the way the district system is set up. You do have a lot of engagement with community development officers and the government workers in these districts. I do like the idea of having them as a partner because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things is to see how we can leverage the positioning of the government to kind of influence the policies around certain things that are creating roadblocks to digital access or financial inclusion for participants. So if there were ways to streamline cost around data and airtime, if there are ways to mitigate, transaction fees for mobile money users in VSLA groups, for instance, these are all the kind of policies we'd love to have the government participate in influencing. So that's something we're doing, and I think on the larger scale, if you're looking at scaling programs around digital inclusion, financial inclusion, having the government participate in the training and the rolling out of skilled workforces to help build the capacity of the communities you're working in would be a very useful tool. So I agree with Mary, and I like the fact that you guys are open to working with the government because it does play a big role in these kind of development projects. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. No, I mean, I think working with government is absolutely essential. Just to repeat, I think, generally the model for locally led adaptation is local government meets community representatives for a participatory planning process. And I think that's super important. I don't think that communities will be able to do it on their own because adaptation does require investment in collective infrastructure quite often, which usually the local government is best positioned to deliver. Any other questions or comments?
Graham, this is Arjun. I had a question for Eric.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Eric. I just wanted to understand a little bit how CARE is approaching sort of bringing together, the work that you've done on VSLAs and digitizing the package with the work that it has gone on sort of community-based adaptation and now locally led adaptation. What has been your experience in using VSLA type approaches in advancing resilience at the local level? If you could speak to some of that, that'd be great.
So it's multiple layers to that. For us, the VSLAs have been like a very key or integral entry point into these communities. So usually what happens is once a program is launched and VSLA in this local community adopts it, it kind of trickles into the community like in a natural way. So with the introduction of digital literacy programs and trying to find asset financing for VSLA groups or for women to access devices, it's also allowing other members of the community to start to understand that these are tools that are accessible to them. And naturally, when women are taught anything, they tend to share that information with others. So like the VSLA group is not just a group of women coming to sit down and save. It's a place where people exchange stories, share struggles, and a lot of that community bonding and development is what then leads to the trickle down effect for the programming. So we found that that's very helpful. It's also like a little tricky because, as I said, there are very different personas within the VSLA structures. So we broke it down into 4 particular personas, and realizing that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, especially when it comes to digital inclusion and financial inclusion, because everyone's needs are different. So we have to contextualize situations to make sure that we're focusing on the actual needs. So that's why we use the Women Respond program to like get that direct feedback, so that we're not just making up solutions that we feel are necessary. I like to use the example of, like, I've seen a lot of ag programs where people talk about, we're going to be using drones to scout the land and plant the seeds. And yes, in some situations, that's very possible. But when you're looking at grassroots and rural communities, there's so many layers that we have to tackle before we get to the point that people are flying drones. So the digital literacy, the getting people comfortable with using certain tools like smartphones. We found situations where you hand a smartphone to a group and people are hesitant to use it because they're unfamiliar with it. So like making sure that there's a level of comfort that's introduced to these groups to allow them to use these tools effectively is key. And then also, like, again, back to that reference of the drone, making sure that we're partnering with innovators and private sector operators who are building tools that are very relevant. So we found, like digitizing VSLA ledgers is one of the tools that has been seen to be relevant, and VSLA groups are actively speaking about how this is helping them. We've had issues with groups have issues with the share out process being too long, because they have to go back through hundreds of paper records to do the calculations, and if there's a miscalculation, share outs could take as long as 3 weeks. But once they understand the value of using a digital ledger and how quickly this can be done, something that took 3 weeks can be done in half an hour, and it's accurate. And everyone also has the access to their own information. So a lot of the digital ledgers might be built on smartphone technology, but have a USSD capability, so that after the meeting, group members are able to receive an SMS showing them exactly how much is saved, how much went into the record, so that everyone has equal opportunity to view and understand how this process works. So it's complicated, and I feel like my train of thought went too far, and I might have lost some of your question, but I hope I answered some of it in that ramble. Yeah, but if I didn't, please ask again, and I'll do better.
Eric, that was great. I'd like to ask a supplementary question, though, which is, do you think that there's a role for, because we see in mobile money, for example, quite often what I call agent-assisted work, transactions being made. Is there, do you think, a role for the outreach agents that I talked about playing that? So rather than, banging our heads against, how do we make this work, and the community do it themselves? Is there a role for those outreach agents to provide assistance with those digital technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen in a lot of cases where in rural communities where people are not so comfortable with the technology or the introduction of these tools, there are standout cases where you find what we call digital champions. And those people become the people who train the other members of the group. And I'll give an example for in Malawi, we found a program that has used mobile money and created a wallet that is specific to VSLA group practices. So any group members can join, start their own mobile wallet, and it's all digital, and it's all on USSD on feature phones. They've introduced asset financing to make sure that group members are able to afford the devices. And one thing that the group members brought up to us was that they still have to travel a certain distance to access a mobile money vendor. And as I was speaking to the representative from the MNO, I was like, why aren't you training some of the VSLA group members to become mobile money vendors? And because there are clearly some digital champions among the group who want to become mobile money agents and can provide this service and make this whole process more efficient for everyone. So we can see that by the MNO tinkering that aspect of it, because the barrier for those women in these groups is they don't have the startup capital. But the group is already saving money on this mobile wallet, and they're going to be doing all these transactions. So how do you utilize the fact that the money is being used by the group, it's being saved on your wallet, and there's some agents, some members of the group who could potentially become agents? Can we waiver the fee, the startup capital fee for them, and create some sort of like financing mechanism that allows them to start the business and it'll allow the transactions to continue seamlessly? So there's so many different areas that we can leverage these relationships, and not just on the transactions of mobile money, but also like the highlighting these agents to become trainers, to become agents and continue the work that we're doing. We currently use community-based trainers, but they're trained in so many different things. We don't want to have situations where we have these people who are, you know, jacks of all trades but masters of none, when we could actually be using mobile money agents who understand this particular thing really well and skill them more to understand and leverage the VSLA group relationships to build a more sustainable system. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, let me open it up for any other questions. If not, I've got a follow-up one, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So if anyone else has a question, please chime in now. Get my follow-up question. Are there examples within your system, Eric, of financing a community based enterprise or activity? So not individual lending within the VSLA, but as a group. And if so, how's that? What's the experience been like? Because traditionally it's been problematic.
Yeah. I can think of one particular example in Uganda where we had a VSLA group that was doing, they were making soap, like detergent. And what happened is once they started using mobile money, they realized that they were able to actually borrow from that mobile money account the amount that they had within their savings, which was basically doubling their funds so that they could scale their business. And through that, their plan is to scale their business by encouraging other VSLA groups to now start developing the soap as well, making the same soap so they can start selling it as like a cooperative of VSLA groups. But the cool thing about this was this interaction started on WhatsApp. So like once they had access to smartphones, these groups were now starting to communicate with each other. And it's been very inspiring to watch, because a lot of the time, a lot of our focus is on the financial inclusion aspect, but we miss the key element of like the communication aspect. So one of the things that we got as feedback from the groups who then got access to smartphones is like the communication aspect is so important to them. And by them being able to communicate with each other, these kind of enterprises can start to grow. So like they understand what group in other districts is doing and how they could leverage off that, or who's doing something similar and how they can work together to build something bigger than what they have. So, I mean, it's cool. But yeah, the link to mobile money services did allow them to then get that easy access to capital, because those loans are generally easier to access than a bank or a microfinance institution, because it's based on what you have in your wallet. So yeah, that's been cool.
Brilliant. Okay, many thanks. Jesse, over to you.
Thank you, Graham, and thanks, Eric. I mean, and Wendy and Absentia and Arjan and all who joined us. I just wanted to say how much, on behalf of the CPAR Alliance Secretariat, we really appreciate everyone taking the time to advance this conversation on this really critical topic for adaptation and resilience and innovation at that nexus. I've dropped into the chat some details on how you can continue to be engaged in the conversation and stay connected, obviously, to all of you who've been presenting and speaking and sharing your work today and asking questions, and also the work of the CPAR Alliance and our 14 plus members and 90 organizations that are engaged in really critical knowledge building work in our collab. So just wanted to thank you again to you, Graham, and to the speakers and to all of our participants for joining us today. I look forward to the next conversation.
Many, many thanks indeed to all. And anyone who wants to, I put my email address in the chat, so feel free to reach out. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Thanks all. Go well.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.